Welcome to Live from the Future, where we explore frontier tech that will change the world. My name is Wiz, and you can find me on Twitter at whimsicalwiz. Unfortunately, Elon Musk could not make it today, but in his place, we've got Peter Rojas from Betaworks to talk about the future of synthetic reality. Peter Rojas was the co-founder of a few very popular technology blogs, including Gizmodo, Engadget, and Joystiq. The latter two were part of Weblogs, which was acquired by AOL in 2005. He later co-founded the consumer electronics social networking site Gadget, which AOL also acquired in 2013. And post-acquisition, Peter stayed on for a couple of years as their VP of strategy and director of AOL's experimental products group. Peter is now a partner at Betaworks, a startup studio and seed stage VC that invests in frontier tech based here in New York and also in San Francisco, where Peter is today. Peter, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on. And I should distinguish, I don't work for the original Betaworks. I just work for Betaworks Ventures, which are two separate entities now. And so I often people ask me about the studio incubation side of things, and I have no experience on that for Betaworks. I've never been involved in that side of things. So I get a lot. I get probably like one email a week about it.
Oh, wow.
And it's, I try to refer to somebody on that side, but I just focus on Matt and I just focus on the investment side of things.
Got it. Cool. Great. Let's jump in. Let's take a moment and teleport to the future together. Are you ready?
Okay. Yep.
Awesome. It is now November 2029, 10 years from now. Paint me a picture of how synthetic reality shows up in our daily lives.
Yeah. And just for context, what I mean by synthetic reality is really thinking about how AI and machine learning are transforming the ways in which we're able to create and generate new forms of media, new forms of new experiences, new kinds of interfaces in which we are able to interact with computing and with each other. And so it's something where, in some respects, we've already seen some of this in 2019, so 10 years ago. But today in 2029, what we see is that we see it expressed in a lot of different ways. I mean, one is the ability for somebody with just a phone, the average phone in their pocket, is able to create hyper-realistic computer graphics, computer graphic imagery. So something that would have taken tens of millions of dollars and thousands or tens of thousands of hours of an illustrator or animator's time to create a Pixar movie in the 90s or the 2000s. Now, an 11-year-old can create that in their pocket. And it's not just as good, it's actually higher quality. And some of that is computing power done locally at the edge, but a lot of it is actually accessing, cloud-based GPUs, which, if you can imagine what was powerful in 2019, I mean, just the ability, the GPU power that you'll have in a cloud-based server will be absolutely mind-blowing. And will cost very, very little.
In 2019, we were on our way to 5G. Now in 2029, we've got 10G.
Verizon is trying to sell us on 6G right now and get us to overpay for that. No, I mean, I'm super excited about about 5G and what Verizon and AT&T and all they're trying to bring here in the US. But
okay, so an 11-year-old can make Avengers on their phone, right? Avengers studio quality stuff.
How
does it actually show up in our daily lives?
So exactly. So you have new forms of content which manifests itself, and so you think about the kinds of social media content we had 10 years ago in 2019. It was people were making short videos. They were able to edit them and add some basic effects and things like that. Now people are able to create incredibly high quality super realistic content, videos, shows, game like experiences for very, very little. In fact, they proliferate. We're inundated with them. But there's still the problem of sort of quality, right? Which like finding the good ones. And so, people create interesting little things and they circulate virally. But then you also, just in the same way that, YouTube was able to democratize, video creation and new types of series and types of programming, by opening it up and by basically saying it just shouldn't cost you any money to host a show. And as the cost of production came down, we saw lots of new kinds of content. So, just as we had with YouTube, there was new types of series, new types of fictional program, new types of nonfiction program, people hosting things, people just, shooting videos of their gameplay and stuff like that. I think, in 2029 with synthetic reality, we see people, creating new types of, essentially computer generated animated shows, content that again is just opens up the creative abilities in ways that you never could before. You're not limited by a special effects budget or your talent as an animator. You really are able to, in a sense, describe what it is that you want and have that expressed in, as graphic, in graphical format, as video. And so I think it's going to open up a whole new kind of, forms of creative expression. I think that you will have, it'll be interesting to see, generations now, people who are, adults now, sort of deriding kids as not really putting real work into creating things. Just in the same way that, probably 10, 15 years ago, people were sort of deriding YouTube as not being real, right? Or podcasts as not being real. I mean, I went through a whole thing as an early blogger as blogging not being real work, not being real journal, real writing. And now nobody makes that argument anymore.
I think in 2019, we saw some of this democratization of creative abilities. I would say change the way that people interact, or at least start to change the way. Like, as an example, TikTok makes it really easy for people to make really creative and interesting and fun videos. And how we saw that actually change behavior is people moved away from like stupid, like, hey, here's an Instagram clip of like me doing nothing, to like actually taking time to script something funny and interesting and like involve their friends. And there's two parts there for me. One is like the being mindful in what they're actually creating. But the second part that I think is super interesting is I think it's more playful. Like, creating a scripted video with your friends is way more playful and social than me posting and broadcasting an Instagram story. Like, I think social is lost in the social media of 2019, Instagram, Facebook.
Well, if you think about it as, and this is why I say, like, it becomes really about like the quality that people are able to create, and that the hard part is being creative in what you're doing. And so once you remove once you reduce the barriers between your idea and your ability to express that idea, it means that like TikTok, for example, TikTok did two things really well. One was had a really awesome AI and personalization engine. So people were able to, like, when something was good and people liked it, it was able to circulate. That was interesting.
Not just influencers got millions of likes. Anyone had the ability to get millions of likes.
But I think the other thing is, the tools that we have to be able to create the videos became incredibly easy to use. And so the barrier between having an idea and being able to realize that idea, that gap narrowed, right? That there's a narrower gap between that. And I think that's what synthetic reality, is doing and will continue to do, is to narrow that gap between what you want to do and your ability to actually do that. And I think we see that over and over and over again in all sorts of mediums. I mean, it's certainly, if you think about, again, if you go back to when, synthesizers were introduced into, and drum machines were introduced into music, a lot of people derided that as not being really music, right? But it enabled new forms and styles of music, because people were able to say, I'm now able to create the music in my head and get it out there, in this form that I couldn't do because, either I didn't have either the technical ability to be able to perform, the instrument, or it was a kind of music that was really almost impossible for people to play, or be able to construct new styles or forms of music by using kinds of sounds that were not organic, coming from, actual instruments, right? And so I think that.
I was going to say, it sort of enables that creator spirit, right? It's like people have this creativity in them. The trouble is being able to actually express it. And some people are more talented than others in being able to express it. But I think you said lowering that gap and friction allows more people to express their creative spirit.
Yeah. And I think it's the same thing with blogging, right? Where blogging was, a lot of people wanted to write, but, being good enough to write for a magazine or a newspaper was, and certainly there was a limit to the amount of, column space available in those outlets. And so a lot of people, we saw an explosion of creativity because they could write for free. You didn't have to spend hundreds of dollars to, get CMS and a website and those things. And so to me, the constant theme is around the democratization of people's ability to be creative. And so synthetic reality is around democratizing that around CGI, right, around computer graphics and the ability to express ourselves through that medium. I also think we're going to see, another big part of this is the number of sort of virtual beings or synthetic characters that we, that inhabit our worlds. And I think, the advancements that, we'll see around natural language processing, around the ability to do synthetic speech, around the ability to, create avatars which kind of either cross over the uncanny valley or stay on the right side of it and are sort of playful and fun and engaging. And I think that, again, what's going on there is it's not just about democratizing our creative abilities. It's about democratizing our ability to interact with a computer and to be able to express what we want and have that task performed, right? And I think that is one reason why there's an attractiveness to things like conversational interfaces, to audio, voice-based interfaces, to audio interfaces. And we're still, in 2019, we were still at a very, very early, phase for that. But now 10 years later in 2029, I look great.
Me as well. You have better lighting.
Yeah, you haven't aged a bit.
Better office background.
Yeah. But but I think that for a lot of, I think if you think about the history of computing, it has always been around an evolution of the interface and making it easier and easier for us to interact with a computer to be able to perform the task that we want to get out of it. And that's why when we went from mainframes to was it mini computers and then mini computers to PCs, there's every step of the way an advancement in the ease of use of the interface. And again, the funny thing is, when we introduced, you're way too young for this, but when Windows and these sort of graphical user interfaces were introduced, there was pushback. It wasn't real computing. Real computing is on a command line, right? And the funny thing is, before that, command line was seen as kind of not real compared with punch cards, right?
For the record, my first computer was a 386 with MS-DOS, and I had the whole manual on how to use command line. Yeah.
And
I've aged well, as you said.
Yeah, and I'm still someone who's partial to it. I like a run of a Raspberry Pi, and you got to mess around with the command line to get fully full value out of it. But for most people, computing is something that when the friction to interaction is reduced, the usage goes up and people are able to get the things they want out of it. And so
let me drill down on that.
Yeah.
Something that we talked, I get that these new forms of creation allow the democratization via lower friction and entry points. And I get that, we've seen adoption of these computers and systems over time that we talked about as a result of lower friction as well. But what I would ask is what's below that lower level of friction? And this is something we talked about previously before the episode, is what are the underlying human traits that are driving that? Because just because you make something easy to do or easy to use, I would say does not necessarily mean that people are actually going to use it. It still needs to be something that they want to use. And
I think there's two parts to it. I think that there are things that people want to do, and then things that people don't realize that they want to do. So I think that if you go back to the beginning of the smartphone era, to say 2002, 2003,
sure.
I had a Treo 600 in 2003. And I remember, showing it to people at the time, and they're like, well, why would I want a smartphone? And I was like, well, you can do email, and I had, games on there and apps. I'm trying to remember if I had Google, an earlier version of Google Maps on there or not.
Those were still the Netscape days.
No, this is post Netscape, but but this was, the idea of being able to have an always on computer in my pocket was really appealing. I could Google things, right? Anywhere. And I think, I showed that to a lot of people, and they're like, well, why would I care? And then the iPhone comes out and people are like, oh, now I see, and it wasn't even the first year of the iPhone, really. It was really with things like Instagram and these kind of applications that really tapped into things that people really cared about, which is I think if you go back 15 or 20 years ago and you said, hey, wouldn't it be amazing if you could post your photos so that everybody in the world, your photos for every, your vacation snapshots for everyone in the world to see. Most people would say not interested,
Yeah.
right? But it turns out that like, we actually enjoy the process of sharing those things. And I'm someone who actually doesn't use Instagram, but most people enjoy sharing those things with others, right? And having that sort of, and there's a lot of like, obviously we're experiencing a lot of the negative, externalities around the social stuff, which, we could talk for hours about that, right? It's a well-trod subject. But I think that, what we found is that when you reduce the friction to computing, and it's not just about the interface on the phone, it's about the fact that it is portable with you all the time, and something that has a consistent high-speed connection, and it has also a camera, right? And has other like input mechanisms. So I think we think just about the screen, but the camera is also an interface. It's also an input mechanism, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about a way for taking the world around you and inputting it into the computer. And I think, again, that's something that's really underappreciated about smartphones versus other computers, right? And so, to me, the thing that we keep coming back to is that when you offer connectivity and easier to use interfaces, people do find new uses that we didn't necessarily think of before. And this is why like 5G is interesting, because right now there's a little bit of like, well, like, it's 5G, but is it like just the same things faster, or like there are new things that end up emerging? And I look at it as, this is a question that was best answered 6 years ago, right? In 2023, right? Like we're a few years in, and founders and people experimenting came up with really counterintuitive, maybe, or non-apparent uses for the lower latency, higher speed connection that weren't apparent to us in 2019. Just in the same way that a lot of things around like smartphones didn't manifest themselves until we had ubiquitous LTE connections and phones with like higher quality cameras and fast enough software and enough memory. And all of a sudden, Instagram, again, to come back to that example, because it's sort of the such a great example, but
Sure.
it's something that a couple of years earlier would have been too early, and people did try to build mobile photo blogging products prior to Instagram. Just people didn't have fast enough connections, or the phones weren't good enough, or the cameras weren't good enough. And so I think when you have this, when things coincide like that, really interesting things can happen.
Using that Instagram example, like I understand that a lot of things came together for Instagram to have low enough friction where people felt comfortable sharing and posting. Something that you used to describe that process, that was the joy of sharing. And I would say that prior to Instagram, humans have always had that joy of sharing. Like before Instagram, there was like photo albums that we would like print out photos and like put them into a photo album. And like before that, there was like stories around the fire, right? I can't help but think that underneath the reduction of friction and the new technologies and all the things that we can layer on top, it still comes back down to that human innate desire, joy of sharing, joy of creating, whatever it may be. And I'm wondering if that's what is driving the adoption of these things. Like for sure, the lower friction in the technology, like the ease of the technology and like whatever. And I think as you and I as nerds, like we care about that stuff, right? But like if we look at the innate human qualities below, I guess I wonder what drives some of that. Like we were talking about synthetic characters.
Yeah, I mean,
2019, Lil
yeah.
Michaela. Like what's the innate human quality that drives people wanting to interact with those synthetic avatars?
Yeah, I mean, look, people, there's a handful of things that people really like to do, and the reason why the internet, writ large, has been so successful is that people do really like interacting with each other. It drives us crazy, but it also makes us furious. But we do really like interacting, being seen, right, being recognized, and again, we all experience that in different ways. Like I don't use Facebook or Instagram at all, and don't really care about that. Sure. But I'm doing a podcast, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that it's why like the tagline for our fund is like investing in the future of how we connect, right? Because I think fundamentally like that's what we care about, and I think again we're seeing some of in 2019 we saw some of the downsides to everyone being connected and some of the negative things that happened to that. But to tie it back to like the virtual beings.
Yeah, because connecting between humans makes sense to me, but how do we get that same feeling of connection when it's with virtual beings, with like things like Lil Michaela or like Hugging Face or whatever it may be?
Yeah. So here's the thing: we have always had characters, right?
Yep.
Characters are a way of human expression and human interaction, and we interact with and through characters. In part because characters are kind of, their archetypes are ways that we are able to understand ourselves and the world around us, right? And so if
Mm,
you go back to, I mean, have you read the Epic of Gilgamesh?
I have not.
You should. It's the first story, right? It's like the first human story we have recorded.
Okay,
It's amazing.
I will
Um,
check it out.
and what's so powerful about Gilgamesh and why it was such a story that was repeated is because it had these sort of two archetypal characters, um, where you know where Gilgamesh, who was this king of Sumeria, in Sumeria, his best friend dies and he tries to go on this quest to find immortality, right? And
Mm,
it's a story that everyone can relate to, which is a sort of like, we all know we're going to confront death, right? And so, characters, whether they are as epic as, Gilgamesh or Star Wars or whatever, or as silly as, Mario, right?
sure.
They are all ways in which we are able to, better understand ourselves and understand the world around us and think through our relationships with other people. And so I think, virtual characters, in some way, we already do interact with virtual characters, in part with whenever time you play a game, right? But you're the virtual character. Like if you play Red Dead Redemption, you're the virtual character in a way,
Yep.
interacting with a bunch of other virtual characters, and you're playing that character. And I think, the I think there's a temptation to think of it as, we saw Her, and like that a lot of this is going to be substitutional, or that like people are going to fall in love with, virtual characters and, virtual beings and things like that. And certainly some of that will happen. And humans can be surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, manipulable, right?
Yep.
Emotionally.
Yep.
But I think that, to me, it's just the latest evolution of, how we have characters, these characters we have in our world, the ways in which we're able to interact with them. And I think, those went from books to movies to, games, and now virtual beings are the next evolution of that. And the level of interactivity has gone up in each stage. And again, I think we always do this thing where we look back on people who are attached to the last generation sort of think of as the next thing as being weird or foreign.
Yeah.
But the same way people thought, I don't want to see characters that I love from books represented by movies, because that is, somehow like fake or not as good,
Yeah.
or, tarnishing it. And yeah, I mean, books are usually better than movies, right? That's usually true, not always.
Totally.
But that's kind of beside the point. And I think, people said the same thing when characters went from, movies to video games, where, oh, well, you shouldn't get to play the character because the character, like the character wouldn't really do that, or, those kinds of things. And now we're with virtual beings. It's, well, you shouldn't really be able to have a conversation with them. Like you shouldn't, interact with them. It shouldn't be your friend.
So now in 2029, where we're interacting with virtual beings every day, remember we're new to 2029. We don't know the full flow of it, but has that impacted our ability to communicate with humans in real life? Like now that we're so used to interacting with synthetic beings and virtual characters and have that distance, does that impact our human relationships?
I don't think so.
Why?
And the reason why is that, first of all, people do crave human relationships above all else, right? I do think that there are going to be, just like we had in the, the 2000s and the 20 teens, there are going to be people that retreat into online worlds, and try and feel uncomfortable interacting with, real humans. And certainly, like, before virtual beings proliferated, people just play video games or watch movies or just read books, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, one of the challenges, I think, for companies that are creating these virtual characters is that, you do have to be mindful of the emotional impact you can have on people interacting with them.
Mm-hmm.
But, the same, Facebook faced the same issue where, the tenor of someone's newsfeed also has an emotional impact on them.
Totally.
And so I think that, for all the, I think it's just, one seems much more visceral and, impactful to us. But I think we really underestimate how much our emotional state, our mood, is, affected by
Other humans.
every other humans and all the media in our life. And it's if I have one suggestion, it's that we don't let everybody else off the hook just because we perceive a greater degree of intensity from the experience interactions we have with virtual beings.
That makes sense to me. Cool.
And I'm not about letting anybody off the hook. I think there are strong moral and ethical obligations that people that create this stuff have.
I agree with that 100%. And I think we'll see a lot more focus and attention on that as well as we advance. Let's transport back to 2019. Do you have a sound effect to transport us back? I only have one to go forward.
I only have the virtual background.
Okay, we'll transport back.
Okay.
That was a very beautiful picture that you painted of 2029. Let me ask you, what's your research process when you explore new spaces like this? I mean, synthetic reality is so nascent that a lot of people listening to this will probably be their first time hearing about it.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
You've got an amazing grasp on it. How do you, as a VC, how do you go about getting that good grasp and understanding of the new category?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we do is we try not to, we try to connect the dots after we've seen a lot of dots. So, with a category like synthetic reality, it came out of a lot of the work that we were doing, tracking and seeing developments in the space, in tech more generally. And then you sort of start to see, oh, this work with GANs is related to this work with NLP, and this work with synthetic speech, and this work with virtual beings, and this work with video and special effects. And, so you start to see some of the commonalities there and some of the things that people are doing. So part of it is just about paying attention and reading a lot every day, which is, I use an RSS reader still. I can't believe I honestly can't understand of anybody who doesn't use one, because it is such a competitive advantage in being able to, maybe I shouldn't talk about it, but and being able to, digest and get through a lot of information quickly, because, I have probably subscribed to about 100 something, news feeds.
Do you use
a mix of what?
Feedly?
I use Feedbin with the reader as the front end for that. And that's sort of the mix that I like. Feedly I like, but I don't love. And so Feedbin I sort of settled on, which, costs $20 a year, but it's great.
And are you doing concerted research into a specific space? Like, are you like, hey, like I'm going to spend the next month like really understanding synthetic reality, and like those are the articles I'm going to pay attention to in my feed reader?
No,
or is it
well,
just
I think
you absorb everything?
I think that what it is it's more, I think this is interesting. I'm going to start following, people in this category. So when I got really focused on like AR, for example, I started, following a bunch of people writing in the space, and, not just, actually I find sometimes the personal blogs to be a little bit better for this. And there's not, and people don't, they're not as many of those as there used to be, I guess, of these sort of targeted, sites, but following, and trying to understand like what's going on in the category, and then, diving a little bit deeper into some of the research when it makes sense. I think, I'm not an engineer, and I think on some level, like doing like I understand enough about optics to be able to understand like the challenges of like Magic Leap, but I don't need to be like an optical, an optics, engineer or something like that to be able to, evaluate some of this stuff. And the same thing with synthetic reality. It's like, understanding, how GAN works, and, and the techniques behind this stuff. And also I think having an understanding of some of the issues around training data and, how machine learning, works, to be able to, when you talk to a startup, being able to sort of really press them on like, well, how are you getting the results you're getting? Like, where is this coming from? And it's not just about, I'm not trying to like, catch them out or anything. It's really about like trying to understand where's the defensibility layer and what they're doing. And so when people are using, publicly available like pre-tagged data sets with publicly available like TensorFlow models, there tends not to be a lot of like long-term defensibility in a business like that, unless you're like super good at like acquiring customers, versus somebody else who could do the same thing, right? In terms of the product. So, I try not to, one of the things that I try to do is to have an open enough aperture in terms of the things that I'm looking at, that when something new starts to bubble up, I can start to see, again, you can start to see the patterns and connect the dots around things here. And so part of it's like, what are developers playing with, building, in their spare time messing around with, experimenting with, because they tend to, be people that are, and just when I was leading experimental product at AOL, like our job was, like we got the Apple Watch, SDK early, right?
Yeah.
So we were able to like build an Apple Watch app, and start to like just understand like what's here. And it turns out it probably wasn't as amazing an opportunity as we would have liked, but that's sort of how you have to do this stuff, is you have to experiment and play with it. And as a VC, you have to be willing to experiment, so to speak, with the places that you pay attention to, and be prepared to spend time trying to understand something, and not necessarily invest in it. So we, spent a lot of time with VR, made only really one investment, a company called Rec Room, which pretty happy. They're doing really, really well. But, I didn't make 10 VR investments for all the time that I spent on it. But I understood it really well, spent time in it, still have like 5 VR headsets, here. You can't see them, but they're around.
A lot of these things that are bubbling up are quite new, right? And some of them, like VR, like we've been talking about VR for 10 years now, right? Yep. And like we're still not there, and like we're getting there, right? Now the Quest is out, and like it's a lot more accessible. How does the longer intrinsic time horizons for a lot of these like frontier techs that you work with and invest in, how does that affect your decision making as an investor, and also just like the economics of the fund, right? Like in a B2B SaaS business, like I know that like they can go from 0 to $100 million in revenue in 7 years, and there's like a proven formula there, and like it makes sense, right? Money in, money out.
Yeah.
Synthetic reality, like it's, who knows what that's going to look like over the next 10 years, and like maybe it'll blow up 20 years from now, but like how do you take that into account, and how do you take it into account in the actual fund economics?
Well, fund economics is slightly different in that, like, what you do want to make sure that you're not over allocated to one category. We wouldn't put like 50% of the fund into one category, right?
So more diversity then in frontier tech, because you don't know which space is going to take off.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, one reason why we do our camps is that it allows us to, do like 6 to 10 investments in a category really early, not have to deploy that much capital, because the investments are relatively small, but we get to understand the category really well. We get to work with the companies really well, but it also helps us understand the contours of where we think the market opportunities are based on the time that we spent with those companies. And so a lot of times, we'll do a camp, and then the companies that we invest in after the camp, like outside of the camp, are the ones that like we think are going to blow up, right? Which not that we've had at least like 1 or 2 breakouts out of every camp so far, which is pretty amazing. But part of the purpose of camp is to help us understand the category so that we can see where the opportunities are, so that we can start to map out the opportunities in that category and understand where the early opportunities are and where the later opportunities might be. So like with synthetic reality, where the early opportunities are something like deep trace, which is around deep fake detection. And we think that, I think that the risks for around deep fakes are slightly overblown, because I think that it's one of those things where we've seen more articles about the risk than we've actually seen damage.
Totally. Yeah.
So far, which I think is good, because I think it's starting to educate.
It's not a new thing. Like there's been fakes in different formats again since the beginning of time, like early day forgery.
You can fake people with text, right? I mean, it's like you can go like Photoshop a fake tweet, and like you're tricking people, right?
Or a Sharpie.
Yeah, it's but I think that like educating people around the fact that this is a thing, and that like they need to be like, more skeptical in the way that they view things, I think that's good, right? And so I'm not as concerned that, maybe famous last words a year from now, but right after the election, but that like deep fakes will probably not be as big of an impact on the election as I think there'll be a lot of people like that will try, but I think I think it won't work. But you can see how tools for helping us detect this stuff will be valuable, and not just in terms of media or social media, but actually I think for forensics, right? For court cases, for police. Like imagine if like I went to the police with a video which I claimed I pulled off my Ring cam of you breaking into my car.
Yeah.
Right. I could fake that right? Like I have
Totally.
enough evidence right now from this call, right? If I'd been recording it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um,
Gonna start
so it's
wearing
like,
masks on the episode.
yeah, I was like, hey, like this guy, like, I mean, I guess he, like we did this podcast and like I pissed him off or something. He like stole my
Saw
car.
his office with his fancy
Yeah.
furniture. Yeah.
And like, if I go to the police right now, they're going to see this video and are they going to, how much would they question it? Right.
Oh,
And I think that that's where you can see something like Deep Trace being, you know, like my mom's boyfriend used to be the head of chief of police in my hometown.
yeah.
And I was having dinner with him and he was like, what are you investing in these days? And I was explaining Deep Trace to him and he's like, oh, wow, we would use, like, of course we would use that. Like we would pay a few $1,000s a month for a subscription to that. If we could take every video that someone claimed came off their Ring camera or their phone, and we could just do a quick check to make sure that it wasn't manipulated, like why wouldn't you, and so that's where I think that like for all the sort of, Twitter, Facebook kind of hype around this stuff, I actually think there are a lot of really clear, forensic based applications of this stuff that I think are going to be really, really valuable. You can imagine like divorce, there are going to be divorce cases where people are going to do this stuff. I mean, it's as the tools become democratized, there are these malicious, uses of it. And so I think having tools to help us better, identify and combat that stuff is going to be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think there's certainly lots of powerful use cases for all kinds of the different frontier techs that we've talked about today, including deepfakes. Something we haven't seen though is a ton of grand slams in frontier tech. Like there hasn't been any like massive or as many in like, boring B2B SaaS, big $10 billion exits. Is that something that changes
Again, how do you define
in,
frontier? How do you define frontier tech? Because Snapchat's an AR company, right? Face filters are AR.
Yeah.
There's no way around that. And that, what's face? I mean, they're 10 billion today, but they're certainly like a valuable company, right? So I actually think that, I think that frontier by definition is something that's changing, and things that were frontiers, 10 years ago are commonplace today. You think about, the real-time web, that was frontier technology, 10 or 12, 15 years ago. And now it's very, very mature and we take it for granted. But the fact that the things that you could do in terms of, having like these real-time synchronous experiences, or, having the ability to deliver content, at scale to, hundreds of millions of people, that is frontier technology in its own way. Right. And I think that, mobile was a frontier technology at one point. And you're not going to tell me there aren't a lot of multi-billion-dollar companies in mobile, right? So
I'm not going to.
Yeah. So I think it's partly about how you define this stuff, and I think one of the things that's kind of fun is that it does change and it evolves, and I think one of the things that I try to challenge myself to be is to make sure that I am not being overly rigid in the way that I am trying to think about and construct these characters and categories. And so we connect the dots, and we, think there's something here. But you have to be like flexible enough to sort of see where things go. And again, this is one reason why we like to do the camps and do these kind of early, make these early bets, because it forces us to really try to think through, where this stuff goes. And there are lots of ways to be wrong, with this stuff, and only so many ways to be right. But I think, so far with the performance of, Fund One, which has been really, really strong, what we found is that there are, opportunities that emerge. Sometimes they aren't always super intuitive when you start, and companies sort of evolve. I mean, I think, where Hugging Face, for example, is going around natural language processing and like the tools that they're, offering there. It's not where they started. But it turns out that it ends up being an enormous opportunity that is really in sync with where this stuff is going, and it also is sort of on the edge of a lot of things, right? Where it's like NLP is certainly can enable synthetic experiences especially for virtual beings, but it isn't necessarily in and of itself synthetic in the sense that we like to think of it as synthetic. It's more pure AI ML.
Mm-hmm. Supportive.
Yeah, but that's okay, right? And I think that if we we don't want to be in this place where we're sort of being so rigid on how we define the buckets that, we're missing things that we think are interesting. And so it's why, we'll sometimes dip into a category that we wouldn't necessarily do just because we think there's something really interesting about the approach that they're doing. So, we invested in Dirty Lemon, for example, which they make a functional beverage, right? They make like a detox lemonade. That's their first product.
I've had some.
Yeah, Coca-Cola just led their Series A, and we wouldn't normally. We actually not really a fan of investing in direct to consumer, but the way that they were doing direct to consumer with this sort of like conversational SMS based commerce with like a lot of interesting like NLP being layered into it, and they bought Poncho and to expand their NLP technology as part of it. That kind of got us really excited, right? It's like, I mean, the drinks are, the drinks are great, right? And very popular. But if they were just selling, if it was just about a beverage, we'd be like, yeah, that's fine, not for us. So it's when they're doing something really interesting on the interface side, that sort of a new kind of differentiator and sort of like the technological approach that they're taking to interacting with the consumer. That got us really interested.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's wrap up with a quick fire round. So I've got just 4 fun questions.
Okay.
Book or movie recently on the future of tech that you can't shut up about?
Book or movie? Well, it's funny because I actually have I've seen very few movies lately. I didn't see a single movie in the theater last year.
Really?
Yeah.
What about this year?
I've only seen one in the theater this year.
Me too. Joker is the only one that I've seen this year.
I saw Into the Spider-Verse in January.
Books then?
But books, I was one that I was reading was called Seeing Like a State, which I thought it's not new, but a really interesting book about how sort of the rise of like the bureaucratic state tries to the ways in which needing to measure and create kind of like accounting and bureaucratic systems requires the state to sort of take these sort of messy, disorganized systems of whether they're villages or economies or whatever, and start to sort of like organize them and streamline them and make them kind of clean. And how it ends up having to be able to have this sort of abstract representation of a system, you have to leave out a lot of leave out a lot of data, like leave out a lot of things, because any representation has to leave something out, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're just overwhelmed with information, you can't really make any decision. So
not a representation anymore.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Borges with the like map, which is the the size of the country that it's mapping, right?
Yeah.
And so I really like enjoyed that book because it was not that it's necessarily like that surprising, but it was just like a really it was less new the argument. It was more like the actual case studies that he went through, where he's like talking about like forestry in Germany and like like the tax system in like pre-revolutionary France and and stuff like that. And that was like, I really was like nerding out on that stuff. I loved it.
Cool. I'll add it to the list. What about top 3 synthetic reality startups that you've seen recently?
That's a great question. I'd say Resemble.ai, which is doing a synthetic speech, and their product is like head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of what they're doing. And they just released a new kind of like cloning system.
They're Canadian, right?
They are Canadian, and they also oh well, there you
go. We all know each other.
Yeah, I assume it's I mean, I don't know how big or small that community is, but super talented, but also doing some really interesting stuff about like helping people protect their voice once it's cloned and
cool.
That. So really great team. Love Oxhuman, which is doing virtual pop stars.
Okay.
And they're using AI to generate the music. Okay. And then they have these sort of synthetic characters, virtual beings that are the pop stars, and their plan is to introduce. Their goal is to introduce, like, they get to the point where they're introducing like one a day.
That's cool.
And sort of look at like what are these like micro genres that are trending on Spotify, and like create virtual artists and see if they stick. And if they don't stick, like, you shut it down and you try something new. And they just released a compilation album on Spotify, and some of it's actually pretty good. That was the thing that was like, it's like for AI. Yeah,
I'll add the link in the show notes.
Yeah, you should listen to it. If you're into sort of like glitchy electronic music, which some of which I am, it's enjoyable. So that's one, and then third one. Man, where do I want to? It's hard to pick. I don't want to like necessarily pick too many favorites out of the last camp. But I think a third that I really like right now is Facemoji. Okay. Which they have. In fact, I could have turned on the camera for this for the show, you can flip on the face emoji camera during video calls now. Let me see if
Oh, that's cool.
um,
Yeah, give it a shot.
let me see if it'll work. I got to switch the camera.
Synthetic background and synthetic face.
It may not work because I'm not sure if I've updated it recently. Let's see. Will it work? Did it just, I think I just,
Oh yeah, it's working.
yeah.
Oh,
So
hey,
that's so cool. I can do the rest of the call as my avatar.
That's hilarious. Cool.
Yeah. So and the thing about it is, I think I can also like change it. Oh no, I don't think I can change it in real time. Oh yeah, because I actually have my one avatar on my account on this account. But let's see if it goes back. So I just like love what they're doing with like the playfulness of it and like giving people like fun tools. But also like you can do it on Twitch now. You can, and I think one of the things that's really underappreciated about, I mean, it's mainly people doing in the app and like creating like stories and content and sharing with their friends. But if you are someone who like wants to stream your gameplay on Twitch or Mixer, for example, but you don't necessarily feel comfortable having your face out there, which for a lot of like for a lot of women, the privacy issue is a really big thing, and so it's kind of lets you participate without having to like give up your privacy.
That's cool.
So it's kind of a fun thing. So I love what they're doing, and the camera part is like,
that was awesome. I'm gonna download it.
Yeah, you should check it out.
What about last two questions? Who's the number one frontier tech person that we should all be following on Twitter?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I'm trying to think of who's like really focused on frontier tech. I don't know. I mean, I feel like you should follow my partner, Matt Hartman, because I feel like he's just so good at this stuff. But
Matt is going to be a guest on the show.
Yeah, Matt's going to be a guest, so maybe I shouldn't pump up Matt too much. Yeah, no, Matt's good. Michael Dempsey from Compound is also
really like his writing.
Yeah, I'm not sure how active he is on Twitter these days, though.
He's pretty active. Yeah. I follow him. I consume a lot of his stuff.
Okay.
Last question.
Yeah, sure.
SF or NYC?
Do you ask that to everybody or just me?
Just you.
Just me. So I'm in SF now. I was in New York for almost 15 years. I moved here back to SF about 4 years ago.
And I was in SF before this and just moved to New York 6 months ago. So.
Well, what do you like better?
The question's for you.
I would say New York is a good place to be young, and San Francisco is not. I would say, and so like I couldn't imagine being here in like my 20s. And I was here in my 20s, and then I moved to New York when I was like 26. So there are things I like about both places. I think New York is, is like a global city in the sense that it has, it's big, it has so much, it has a lot of things besides tech. I think here, especially as San Francisco's gotten more expensive, that it has become a little bit more one-dimensional culturally, which I don't love. And so, a lot of the people that I was friends with in New York who involved with, art or fashion or, non-tech publishing, and art, the art world and things like that. There's not a lot of that here, especially compared with 20 years ago when I first lived here. So I'd say, LA has taken a lot of that energy from here, and it's taken a little bit from New York too, frankly. But I'm lucky that I have, 2 partners in New York, and I get to go back to New York and work with them and the team pretty regularly. Not as often as I'd like, but
you get to escape the cold as well during the winters.
Yeah, so it's a good way to like split the difference, and I get to go back, 5-6 times a year, and still enjoy, things that are nice about San Francisco the rest of the time.
That's a good answer. Good balanced answer. My opinions are much stronger for New York. I did not love San Francisco, but we can talk about that another time.
No, I mean, there's a lot that is frustrating about San Francisco, and I think if I was someone who, I have a nice house. I mean, not a fancy house, but it's like very comfortable. It's like comfortable. I have more space than I have in New York. Had in New York, and it's like I work from home most of the time, but this is my house, not my house, despite appearances. And yeah, my house is filled with my house is also a co-working space.
Yeah.
Uh,
This is your synthetic house.
yeah, my synthetic house. But but for someone who likes to keep kind of a low key lifestyle and just hang out at home and hang out with my kids and play Fortnite, like, San Francisco is fine for that. Like, when I lived in New York, I was not taking advantage of a lot of things that were great about being in New York in terms of like the culture and being able to go out. I couldn't go out at night and
Yeah.
do a lot of those things. So you're not missing as much of that in San Francisco. So it's fine. I'm just happy to honestly hang out at home, read books, hang out with my kids, and go to sleep by 9 o'clock.
Sounds
And
great.
San Francisco is perfectly suited for that.
Nice. Cool.
So,
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Lots of fun today.
thank you for having me. Like, I appreciate the very thoughtful questions and the prep that you put into this.
Yeah, of course. It's my job.